Hi, I'm Mark Bradley and welcome to Testing All the Things, a screencast in which we use live coding to demonstrate different types of testing tools and techniques. In this video, we're going to finish off our book API. We're going to look at handling database connection errors and returning 500s from our API. Let's look at the code. In this video, we're going to add some tests and functionality to handle HTTP 500 cases within our service. For instance, like the database going away. Let's have a quick look at what we created in the previous videos. We've created a number of different types of tests during the past few videos. We've created some end-to-end tests that check our book endpoint, our health check endpoint, and that when we request an endpoint that's not available, we get a 404. We've also been adding integration tests for our book repository, checking that we are able to talk to our database as we expect via doctrine. And finally, we've added a number of unit tests as well for our API problem renderer and our book model. So let's look at the code we wrote from these tests. We have a few classes, but the majority of the business logic for our application currently sits in the app file. So we've got the setup of the container, and then registering of a middleware. And then we go straight into the routing, which is pretty normal for an application. However, this application file has almost direct access to the database via the book repository, which is not really where we want to be for this implementation. We want it to be a lot cleaner. So before we start adding tests, we're going to make some refactors. The first one we're going to do is we're going to move the controller code from our application into a controller class. We're able to do this because we're not changing the external interface of our application. It will still be the same endpoint, and it will still implement the same functionality we were testing with our end-to-end tests. It's just we're going to move it out to its own file. Let's make a start on doing that. Create a new class. So we'll call it book by ISBN controller. And we'll be very good, we'll declare strict types. And there we have it. So we have a new class. And now we can copy across the functionality from our app into our controller. So if we take this, cut it out, we can put it in here. So it says now public function. And we can do very simple. We can, if we use underscore the magic invoke function, then Slim will call this function when the endpoint is hit for us. So if we go here now, instead of having a function, we can pass it a callable. So if we do book by ISBN controller, we want the name of the class. Okay. So by doing this class thing, it just gives us the string, the absolute class name, including any namespaces. So this is a much neater here within our controller. Okay. So we have that, and now we can also, if we import the classes, so we want the Slim request, import the response, and import that. There we go. So we have it, and now it can also be really good and say this returns a response. There we go. Okay. So we're almost there now, but in the app file we had direct access to the container here, which we don't at the moment because there's nothing injected into our class. So we can solve that by adding a constructor. And we can say it gives us, so this comes out of the box from Slim. So if we go container interface, $container, and if we initialize property, there we go. So we can now do this container get. There we have it. So let's get rid of that. So that was a reasonably straightforward refactor. All we've done is we've abstracted the function we had here in our root into a function within a class using the invoke method, so that Slim will call this function when the root is hit. So let's run our tests to see how that looks. Okay, there we have it. All the tests are passing, so our refactor was good. That's really nice. Let's go back and look at the code we've created. Controller function looks reasonably neat. However, the one thing I don't really like about this is we're currently being given access to the entire container here. Now, if our application was much larger than it was, that could be a number of different objects that we suddenly have access to within our controller. It also means that at our controller level here, we need to also understand what's available within our container, which is not really a great place to be in. So let's see if we can improve that. What we'd really like to be able to do here is be given the book repository straight away, rather than having to grab it out of the container here. Now, what we could do as a first step is we could take this here, not store the container, but actually do this book repo, and then this book repo, and grab it out of the container in the constructor. So we're no longer storing the container. We're going to add book repository, like so. So we're given the container, we grab the container out, we grab the repository we want out of the container during the construction. So later on we don't understand that the book repository we have came from a container. That's kind of a halfway house. That's still not quite what we want. We'd really like the book repository to be given to us into the constructor, which would be much better. We're just given the exact thing we need, we can use it, and then we can be done with it. So let's see if we can do that. Book repository, book repo, book repo. So that's what we want our class to look like, our controller class. Okay, nice and small, simple, and easy to understand. So how do we achieve this? So now we need to go back to our application, and we need to look at our container. So far our container contains the book repository, which is great, but now what we can do here is we can put our controller into our container, like so. So if we do container set, now we need the name of the controller here, and again fully qualified with namespaces like the callable here. So we will just do book ISBN controller class, and then we have the function, the anonymous function again. Function, brackets, semicolon. Okay, so what we need to be able to do here is we need to be able to return our new book by ISBN controller. Okay, but our controller requires the repo to be given to it in the construction now. So what we can do is if we go container interface, C, let's get rid of all this. Okay. So we now have access to our container within the container function set. So we can just do $C get, and we can get our book repo. So we're now using dependency injection to create our controller and inject it with the thing it needs to work. So let's run the test and make sure this refactor has also worked. So our refactor worked again. We now have separated the controller out from the application and used dependency injection to ensure that it has access to a book repository as it runs. Let's go back and look at what we have. So far, our code looks really neat. However, our HTTP layer, our controller, still has almost direct access to the database via the book repository. Now, this is not great practice, so what we're going to do for this bit is we're now going to move this book repository functionality out to a new book manager. It's basically going to be a kind of business logic layer, so that our HTTP layer doesn't really have any knowledge of where our book comes from. First of all, we're going to create an interface. Create a new class, and we'll call it ISBN book retriever. No, nope, nope, I want this to be an interface. There we go. So we now have an interface called an ISBN book retriever. We have a single function, public function, and it's going to be retrieve book by ISBN. Okay, there we have it. So we have an interface with a single function, ISBN book retriever, and it retrieves a book by its ISBN. Okay, so now let's go back to our controller. Now we want to do some maneuvering about so that instead of having the book repository, almost direct access to the database, we want to put this kind of business logic layer in place. Our class this controller only needs access to something that can retrieve a book. So it's going to expect to be given the ISBN book retriever. We'll rename this. So, and we'll do a refactor here. Call it book. No, just call it retriever. There we go. And we'll do the same refactor in here. Call it retriever. And now we know that the function's not called get by ISBN anymore. It's called retrieve by ISBN. So there we have it. We've moved knowledge away by adding an interface. Now we need to implement that interface here. What we can do is we can just implement the interface. So it's suggesting we call it ISBN book retriever implementation, but we don't want to do that. So we're going to call it book manager. That seems to make sense. So there might be other things we want to be able to do with books later on. So we'll keep it nice and generic. Nope. Okay. So it implements the interface, and we've got a function. Well, we know what we need this book manager to do. So we're just going to add the constructor. New constructor. Get rid of all of this. Okay. So this is going to take a book repository. Repo. And we'll initialize the field. Get rid of that. Okay. And at the moment, the business logic for our book retriever is very simple. It returns the $this repo get by ISBN. Now we've mucked up the interface here, so we'll fix that here. Well, let's fix it in the interface first and be good. So string $ISBN. Silly. Okay, just do it here. String $ISBN. We can pass that in. Okay, so now we have a book manager. We can go back to our application and rejig our dependency injection. So container set book manager function container interface $C and away we go. So now we need to return new book manager, and we know that we need, if we look at our book manager, that needs a repository. So we can do $this, $C get, we can get the repository. So our controller now takes a retriever and uses a retriever. Our retriever interface is implemented by our book manager, and it uses the repo to get by ISBN. There we go. Let's run the tests and see if our refactor is still all good. It's failed for some reason, so let's go and have a look. So this looked good, and it's our interface. We've changed that to be good. That's a retriever. And let's get rid of this second. Yeah, right. So we're still passing the repository directly into the controller. So that's where we made a mistake. Let's try that again. Okay, and we're all green. Back to green. So what we've shown with this refactor is that our end-to-end test gave us safety to add quite a lot of layers to our application and still see that it worked. So this refactor is now complete. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to adding the functionality we talked about at the start of the video. We're going to look at handling the database not being available when we try to retrieve a book. So if we close everything down, okay, and open our test file. So we open our book test file. So this is our book end-to-end test. So we've got happy path here at the top, So when we get a book by an ISBN exists, we get 200 back, and we get the book represented in JSON format. And when we don't get the book, or the book is not available by the ISBN we give, then we get back a 404 saying we couldn't find a book with the ISBN you gave us. Now we want to handle when the error is not the client's fault, but it's our fault. It's a server error. We want to be able to return a 500. However, for this, we're not going to add an end-to-end test. We're just going to look at testing through those new layers we created with unit tests. We could add an end-to-end test for this because we're using Docker. We can find a way with PHP to stop the Docker container that's running the database or do something to that database so that we got an error back. But we're not going to do that today. I want to look at adding the unit tests that will give me confidence that that implementation will work without having the end-to-end test. Just look at unit testing through those different layers. So let's move into unit testing. We can't really test our app. That was what we would, a lot of the setup there and the wiring together is tested by our end-to-end tests. So we can't test there. So let's go straight to the source folder and look at what we can test. So, well, the app goes straight into the controller. So we can add a unit test for our controller for this 500 error. So let's create, I don't think we've got, no, we haven't got a unit test class yet for that. So let's do that. So if we close our end-to-end test and open our controller, have a controller, create test class. Don't want it into end-to-end, we want it in unit. There we go. Okay. So we can now, let's just move our controller over to the right so we can see both bits at the same time. Looking at our controller, we know it needs a book retriever, and we can call the invoke function. We have to give it a request, a response, an array, and an array of arguments. Let's add our test, a new test method. Test book retrieval. Book retrieval error. There we are. Okay. We know we need a controller, so $C equals new ISBN. Nope, sorry. Book by ISBN controller. Now, a controller needs to be given a book retriever. We need access to a test double at this point. So we can do $R equals mock. There we go. So we're going to create a mock of our ISBN book retriever. There we go. Okay, so nice and simple. So we can now pass this into our controller. Okay. We can, so it returns a response. So response equals, let's see. There we go. Now it also needs to be given a request, a response, and the arguments. So our request equals new request. Not request. Okay. and $response resp equals new response, and our args. So args equals, that's an array, and we know we need an ISBN, and it's a string. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There we go. That'll do. Okay, and so when we invoke it, we have to give it the request, the response, and resp, and the args. There we are. Now we need to look at what we want our functionality to do. At the moment, for 404, it's returning a not found exception. It throws, a not found exception when the book is not found. There's two ways of doing this now. We could manually handle the exception and write our own JSON, or we could expect a different HTTP exception to be thrown at this point. I think using the exception method here would be a neater way of doing it. So what we can do is we can do this expect exception. I'm assuming we can do HTTP. HTTP. I'll assume that there's an internal server error exception from Slim. There we are. There is class. There we go. We have it. We expect there to be, so we don't need the response actually, because we don't need to interrogate it, because we're expecting an exception to be thrown and handled on our behalf and rendered for us. So that makes everything a little bit neater. So actually now these variables are a little bit redundant. Let's just whack them straight in to keep this test as small and neat as possible. See that on one screen, so we'll leave it like that. We expect the exception to be thrown. That's what we want it to do. We're passing in a book retriever for it to use. Okay. And then we're going to run the function. Now, what we haven't done is set up our test double. So at the moment, it will work up until here. It gets passed in because it will implement the interface perfectly. And we can use it here. But when we try to call it, it's going to not do what we want it to do. It's not. I have no idea what it's going to do. If we haven't done anything with it, it might even error out at that point. Let's look at setting that up. So R should receive. So it should receive a call to retrieve book by ISBN. And when we do receive a call to that function, we want it to throw an exception. What can our exception be? So we can create an exception class for us here. And again, like the book not found exception, it will just extend the plain old exception. So let's create a class. So what do we want to name it? Let's say book retrieval exception. Okay. So let's make this as small as possible, like the last one. And this extends exception. There we go. So we can now throw new book retrieval exception. Give it a message, broken. So we now have our unit test set up. Our book retriever looks like it will throw an exception. So we're defining really the interface here for what the book retriever does and what errors it needs to be able to, or what errors it could produce. So let's run our unit test and see what happens. Okay, so it fails. Too few arguments. Oh. Am I using the wrong type of request there? Oh, I am. Shouldn't be that type of request. It should be a request. Slim request. There we go. Now, does this have? Also has things it needs to be given. Oh, that's going to take a little while to write out, so let's cheat. Okay. So response have the same. No, it has defaults. We can get away with that. So let's just do $rec. And because we're not going to use it at all, we can do the simple thing here and do rec equals mockery mock, and we want to mock the request class. There we go. That saves us a bit of work. Okay, so let's run that again. There we have it. So we've now got the failure we expected. We read this. So we expected the Slim's HTTP internal server error exception, but we got the book retrieval exception. No, we didn't. No, sorry. Yes, we expected the HTTP exception, but what we got was the book retrieval exception. So we need to solve that problem. So if we get rid of the test, get rid of the code over here, and have a look at what we can do. We're catching this exception here. So we're not catching the book retrieval exception or doing anything with it. So it's just getting not handled here and thrown back. So we can just add another catch here. Catch book retrieval exception, $E. And we need to throw new HTTP internal server exception. What does this take? It takes the request, so we can pass the request in. It takes a message. We're going to say, what should we say? Something went wrong. Retrieving your book. And we can pass the exception as well. So we're now handling that error. So hopefully our exception will pass. Our test will pass. Let's run it and see where we're at. And it does. A test pass perfectly. Now we need to move down to the next layer. What is that going to look like? Done with the controller. We now need to look at our next layer, and that's our business logic layer. So that is our book manager. There it is. So we've got our book manager. Move it over here. And now we need to create a test for our book manager. end-to-end test. It's going to be a unit test, manager test. There we have it. We're now looking to test our book manager function, retrieve book by ISBN. And we're looking to test the error case. Test handling repository error. And I can't spell today. First thing we need is an instance of our manager. So our manager equals new book manager. And our book manager needs to be given an instance of our book repository. Repository equals Mockery mock book repository. And we're looking at handling exceptions again. So we're going to expect another exception. We expect this expect exception. So we know what exception we're expecting at this point. So we can simply add it here. So it's a book retrieval exception. Our expectation is all set up. So as we call retrieve by ISBN, we don't need to check what comes back because the exception will be thrown and this will catch it and check its type. So we can pass an ISBN. Okay. Now we need to set up our test double again. Our repository should receive a call to get by ISBN. And throw. We're going to have it now throw a different type of exceptions. We need to remap it across. So, well, let's have a nice, reasonably generic exception for, so let's call it book repository exception. There we go. There we have it. And again, we want a tiny little exception class, small as possible, extends exception. So now this will throw a book repository exception class. There we go. Okay, let's give this a bit more visible. So again, very, very simple. There's not a lot of complexity in here, but as you can see, we're just looking to remap that exception. So again, the repository idea doesn't get passed back to our HTTP controller. We've got different layers handling different things. Now I know the business logic is really simplified here, but as you can see, it just shows you how you want to separate out the layers and how the testing is really, really straightforward if you have these very simple, small, separate layers. So if we save that, we'll run the test, see what happens. Oh, shock horror, got an exception. Invalid argument count. Oh, yeah, forgot to pass in the dependency. There we have it. So try again. Now this looks like the error we're expecting from our test. We received a book repository exception when we were expecting a book retrieval exception. So let's see if we can fix this. I'm sure it's not too hard. So let's do a try catch block around this. Book repository exception. And we want to throw a new book retrieval. Book retrieval exception. It takes a message, error getting your book, and a code, and we'll give it the previous exception. Okay. Yeah, I did semicolon. Excellent. And then I'll rerun that test. And our test pass. So we're now 2 layers through adding the 500 error. We've added what the controller should expect back. Make sure we handle it correctly. Make sure we get back the correct HTTP exception from the controller. And then that's defined our interface for what our book manager should do when it fails to retrieve a book for us because of some kind of repository issue. Our business logic is really just mapping exceptions. In a real life scenario, it would not be as simple as this. There'd be a lot of other sort of business logic and things that could happen in this place. We're just trying to simplify it out. So we're now down to our final layer. We're down to our repository testing. Our repository previously hasn't been unit tested, and we're going to continue down that same path. We're not going to unit test our repository because we want to check that we're using Doctrine correctly as well as we are talking to our database correctly. So we'll open our book repository test, which is an integration test. So it actually talks to the database via Doctrine. So it uses, if we can look, if we remember, we create an instance of an entity manager here. We then, in our tests, where we need a book to exist, we add a book, and then we pass that entity manager into our book repository so that we're retrieving the book from the database. So we know everything works as it would in production when we're talking to a database. We have not mocked or created a test double of our entity manager class because we don't own it. We don't know how it works exactly, so that's why we're using integration tests to check that we're using the entity manager correctly rather than making assumptions on how we use it by making a test double of it. So now we need another test. We've got our 2 tests so far, our happy path where it returns a book and our sad path where we don't get a book because there's no book with that ISBN. So we need to add our next test. Test handling DB has gone away. So how are we going to do this? So we need to pass an entity manager into our repo and we need to call get by ISBN. The entity manager we have here is working and it needs to work for our other tests, but it needs to not work for our next test. So what we can do is if we take this here, copy, and we rejig, right, let's make that just a local variable because we don't need it. Okay, again, this test is not going to do what we want it to do, but is there a way we can make our test interact with a database that won't work? Well, there's an easy way. and that is hacker. We can change the username and the password to not testing bad person. There we go. So now, when we try to use our entity manager, try to talk to the database, the username password we have is incorrect. That's how we're going to test our database going away. Someone has suddenly changed the password. Well, usually on our database, but for now we've done that by resetting our password here. We expect an exception again to be thrown, so this expect exception. And again, we know the exception we expect to be thrown because it's been defined by the previous test and the construction of the interface of this function. We expect a book repository exception to be thrown. Book repository exception. We have it. For this test, we can't run it here, so we need to run all the tests. So we will go back to the command line to run it. Okay, so we've got one test failure, which is good. We expected something to fail. Here we go. We got a connection error exception when we expected a book retrieval exception. Oh, I got this wrong. Okay. It's not a book retrieval exception, is it? It's a book repository exception. Okay, there we go. So we didn't get quite the expected outcome for the thing, so we'll just rerun the test again, make sure we do get the error we're expecting to get. So the test failed again. There we go, that's better. So we were expecting a book repository exception, but we got a connection exception. Let's have a look at that connection exception. That's the one. Okay, and that extends dbar exception, which just extends exception. So what we'll do is, because we're looking to handle any kind of exception coming out of our database, what we'll do is we'll catch this exception in our implementation rather than the specific connection exception, so that we know that if there's any kind of exception coming out of the database that is handled by doctrine, is a doctrine exception, it's handled and remapped. So let's go and do that. So we need to open our book repository. Like so. And we need to put a try catch in. So try. Catch. So it's dbar exception $e. And we know we want to throw a new book repository exception. Data repository broken. What does it take? Yeah, I think it takes. Is this fine? Does expand exception. And we'll pass in the. There we go. Have it. So we'll rerun our test again and see if we fixed everything. What have we got wrong there? Is that the right exception then? Connection exception. Right, and we go to our book repository. Goes to there. Have I made a mistake? Let's go and look. Asserting that type matches book repository exception. What mistake have I made? Catch. Try find by one. I wonder if the issue is here, not there. Let's realign that. There we are. Let's try again. Excellent. And there we have it. All our tests are back and passing. Our 500 error handling is now complete. Our implementation of our book repository is complete, which is great. I'm really happy with that. Let's have a look at what we've done this week. Let's close everything down. We'll just go through the code. Close all the group. Close all the group. So we started this week by doing a refactor of our application, moving the HTTP implementation out of the app folder and moving it into our controller. And our controller now is nice and clean. It takes a very simple interface which allows us to access our book retriever. Very generic, doesn't tell us how it retrieves it or anything, just tells us it can retrieve a book by its ISBN if we pass it an ISBN. We use that and we handle exceptions that are coming back from it, which is lovely. And then if we go into our book retriever, that's the implementation. So we go into so that was an interface. We're looking now at the implementation. The book retriever requires a book repository. Again, it doesn't give any detail of what that book repository does. It has an interface that says if we give an ISBN, we can get a book back. And then if we go into our repository, our book repository was integration tested so that we know that any work we do with Doctrine and talking to our database works perfectly well. Now, this is all well and good. This is great. Now, if you want to have a play with this code and maybe add some additional functionality to it and add some actual business logic into our book manager, so sort of doing something after the book has been retrieved. So what you could do is you could do something like if the book has more than 200 pages, then an exception's thrown for some weird reason, and start with an end-to-end test. Add the end-to-end test for creating a book. So create a book with more than those 200 pages, and expect a 500 or 400 or 500 back, some weird exception. Or even you could do something like, if the book's named has the word tea in it, it could return the I am a teapot status code, anything like that, just to have a play with adding an end-to-end test and adding a unit tests into our book manager once you're there. That's everything we're going to do with the book service. I hope you've enjoyed looking at the end-to-end testing and integration testing of creating this service. Thank you for watching this episode of Testing All the Things. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please rate and review the video and subscribe to the channel. If you did not and you have any feedback, please leave a comment in the comment section of the video or contact me on Twitter @Bradle.